Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. You are listening to season 5, this summer of Retro Rounds, which is hosted by Sejal and Lao Now Mao. This season will explore retroactive funding in Web3, and each episode features a different ecosystem unpacking their experience in implementing the retro funding mechanism. We'll explore how they're tailoring retroactive funding to their unique ecosystem, along with the challenges they've faced and ways of overcoming that. This season is co-hosted by Sejal and Lao Now Mao, and the next voices you'll hear on this episode are from them. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, welcome, and super excited for this episode. This is one of the first episodes of the season, Summer of Retro Rounds. I have Lau Namu, who is my co-host for today. So, Lau, what are you excited about in this episode? Like, what should people expect, and what is your excitement about?
One of the things that I'm most excited about in retro rounds in general is the way in which we're able to incentivize different behaviors from people in the ecosystems based on what we are sharing for what kind of contributions we're looking for. And specifically for this episode, one of the things that is really exciting for me is the team leading the Field RPGF round is a really seasoned team that has done a lot of research on incentives. Both Tom and Kiran are part of the crypto econ team, and they've looked at several different distribution mechanisms, several different voting mechanisms, and they bring all of this knowledge when approaching the design for the round. And additionally, because they have this experience of mixing research and implementation, the way in which they've led the execution of this round was really exciting. Like, their main purpose, as they will be sharing with us in the podcast, is around how do we innovate and how do we just launch it so that we're able to have these feedback loops on what worked well and what didn't fast, so that we're able to create new improvements for this mechanism.
And today we have Tom and Kiran from Filecoin ecosystem, who recently concluded the first retro round of Filecoin. So welcome everyone. I would love for Tom and Kiran to introduce themselves.
So my name is Tom. I work closely with the Filecoin ecosystem. I'm also part of Crypto Econ Lab. We're a collective of researchers, software developers, and go-to-market specialists that work together with a bunch of different protocols, helping them design their incentives. Most recently, the thing we've been working on and we've been most excited about is launching Filecoin's RetroPGF program.
Amazing. Kiran?
I work with Tom at Crypto Econ Lab, and I've been involved in the Filecoin ecosystem for about 2 years now. Similar to Tom, my background is in data science and machine learning, and we have been using these skill sets to do incentive design, modeling, and analysis for a variety of crypto projects. And this is a very exciting and interesting take on using and applying those concepts to fund new projects and determine optimal allocation. So this has been an exciting project for us to work on, and happy to be involved.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think for us, this is actually one of the really exciting things, and one of the things that we definitely want to dive into throughout the podcast. Like, we know that the Filecoin ecosystem, through the crypto econ team and through some of the other experiments that they funded, has a lot of experience into looking at how to allocate resources. But for everyone out there that might not be super familiar with the Filecoin ecosystem, could either of you please share a short TLDR? What is the Filecoin ecosystem? What should people be looking at when thinking of it?
Yeah, sure. I can give a couple of sentences and then maybe Kiran can give a bit more detail. But in short, Filecoin is a network of computers and disks that come together and are collectively dedicated to the goal of storing humanity's information and doing this in a decentralized, efficient, robust way. So in order to make this happen, the network has to dedicate a lot of hardware, like literally hard disks to store information. But more than that, it has to bring together many different things that are more kind of ecosystem level, whether that is education, so that people can understand what the mission is and how it works, It has to bring together research. It has, for example, developing the ZK Snark networks and cryptography to make the storage, the work that the Filecoin network does to make this provable. The research developing the crypto economic incentives. So these are the things that make up the Filecoin network, and these are also public goods. So these are the things that we're trying to incentivize too with the recent Phil RetroPGF program. Would you say anything else about?
You actually talked to a lot more detail than I would have gotten into. So when I remember when I was coming into the Filecoin ecosystem, kind of tagline I think that helped me understand it was it's a decentralized version of Google Drive. So, you can use Google Drive to store your data, but one of the problems that Filecoin is trying to solve, in addition to storing, important data that's useful for humanity, is to do it in a decentralized fashion so that all of the data doesn't end up concentrated and by an entity such as Google. There's many solutions out there. So that's at a very high level what Filecoin is about. Like Tom mentioned, taking that visionary concept and breaking it down into something that is actually implementable requires the coordination of a lot of different projects and resources. And that's what's kind of exciting about RetroPGF, is to automatically recognize which projects are making contributions and get them the funding they need to continue doing that to advance this vision.
Yeah. And just to say a little bit about the vision and why it kind of excites me, at one level, really, information is humanity's most important commodity, and where this is stored and who owns it and controls it. This is just super important. At the moment, the market is primarily dominated by a few large centralized players, and it's extremely profitable for those. But there's another way to do things cheaper, and it's more decentralized. So if you can do that, do it.
Exactly. Thank you so much. I always feel so inspired, to know like what sort of motivated you. And it's so good to hear from people themselves and the way they talk about the ecosystem. I'm also curious, like expand a little bit on crypto Econ team, like because you shared that you're part of that. So like, what is that for the audience to know, what that is and, yeah, what happens there?
Yeah, for sure. So we are, as I kind of said earlier, we're a collective of primarily research scientists. So most people in the team come from academic or research background, and we came together to work on crypto economic incentives. Initially, 100% focused on Filecoin, but now we work with many protocols. So it's an exciting business to be in. Would you say anything else about the team, Kiran?
Yeah. We have a diverse background of technical skills. So we have a couple of people that have pure math background. My background's in electrical engineering, and we have some physics background. So what's nice about crypto economics is I think it brings together all of these different skill sets to affect change. Like the whole point of incentives design is so that you can coordinate resources in the real world. So it's been a very cool way to combine a bunch of different skill sets to, do incentive design and see that to fruition.
Yeah, and it is super cool doing the RetroPGF stuff. I mean, this is a crypto economic mechanism. This is stuff we work on, but it's kind of a bit different to most of the other crypto economic mechanisms we work on. A bit more human focused rather than cryptography, perhaps. I mean, it's kind of more operational and more working with people rather than just like simulating how something works and giving some recommendations. But it's like a super cool economic mechanism to implement.
Yeah, and I think this is for me, this is definitely one of the things that I find the most interesting about funding mechanisms, thinking of what are the incentives that we're creating, and then what impact does it have on the behavior of people. I think particularly for RetroPGF, that is one of the things that we're looking to move the needle on, is what are people building, especially as they're building with the expectation of being able to receive one of these rewards. And I'd love to hear, so based on all of this previous work that Crypto Econ team has done around different incentives and crypto economic incentives, different ways in which to allocate funding, what were some of the experiences that you brought into your round design and that you brought with you when you were setting up this retro funding round? And when you decided, hey, let's try out this as the next mechanism that we're piloting within the Filecoin ecosystem?
I mean, I would probably let Kiran answer this one first because he's really the guy who's been doing all of the simulation, which is the kind of normal stuff we do for other protocols, but also bringing this kind of expertise and bringing it into the Phil Retro PGF so that we could try to at least tune some of the parameters ahead of time to make it successful. Kiran can speak to that.
Yeah. So just to build on the previous question a little bit, in engineering, you're always you have a system that you're trying to stabilize and control. And so one of the first diagrams that we made for Retro PGF is a control loop where you have some inputs, you have a desired output, which is not a black box that is an electronic system in this case, but it's people's behavior to contribute public goods to the ecosystem. I just wanted to mention that to say, like, the way we kind of approach problems at Crypto Econ Lab is to kind of boil them down into these well-studied and well-researched mechanisms that are used in other areas of engineering and science, and then apply them. So we kind of viewed Retro PGF as a control loop where if we provided a certain input, what will the outputs do? And then how can we modify that? So that's at a very high level. At to touch on a little bit of the simulations that we've done. When we were implementing Retro PGF, we had certain parameters to choose that would affect how, in this specific case, how the badge holder votes get translated to the amount of funding that a project receives. And there's a bunch of parameters that we could choose from, like how do we aggregate the scores? What thresholds do we use to determine whether a project should get funding or not get funding? There were established practices from other projects that we drew from, but we also wanted to simulate this for ourselves because the parameters of Phil Retro PGF were different than the parameters that were used for Optimism, for example. We built up simulations. We did some analysis, assuming some behaviors to then say, okay, this is the funding. These are the parameters that will give us a desired distribution of funding. That's quite getting into the weeds of everything, but just to zoom out to your original question of how do we apply our backgrounds to determine how to design a Retro PGF round, those are maybe two examples. We can dive into these a little bit more if you'd like, or...
Yeah, I mean, just like I think that's a good point Kiran made. At a kind of broader scale, the way we see the Retro PGF program and what's like attracted us to work on this and it kind of motivated us to implement it for Filecoin is that we see it as like a course setting mechanism for the network. It's a course setting mechanism to steer, create change and set the direction of some large body of software development engineers, researchers. That's just like a super cool thing to do. So that's very much how we see it. We see it as this kind of like 3-stage feedback loop where we're sensing some input and we're sensing some input. And the way that we do that is by, hey, everybody, we're doing this round, submit some applications, and we get all of these applications. And then we do some computation on that. And the computation is done by the kind of decision makers who are the badge holders. We try to, on the basis of the badge holders' output, saying, hey, this is really good. This one is also good, and so forth. Then the funders come in the third stage and they say, okay, great, this is how the capital is going to be allocated. And then that creates some output in terms of the state of the network. It makes things happen. And then you keep repeating this process, you keep repeating it, and things keep getting better. And that's the plan. So I don't know if that answered your question or we're just like rambling on about how much we like Retro PGF and the idea, but there we are.
No, but I think it was really good. Like it's been super interesting to hear. Like given that the ecosystem already has an experience, like there's some other ecosystems that have zero experience with running, like really thinking through the incentives that are being generated through like by the different mechanisms you're using. Like I think like this is one of the things that I'm really interested and fascinated by how Filecoin has been approached.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And that is what I think makes this round quite unique and original, if I can say, right? Like in its own way. I know you mentioned like funders, right? So unlike Cello or Optimism, Filecoin had this unique challenge or opportunity, right? Have different funders. So what was the process like of identifying and then eventually like convincing them, right? If other ecosystems are also looking to take this approach.
Like it was kind of easy in the sense that we just like spoke to a bunch of people who we knew and said, hey, Optimism have done this. It's really cool. We want to do it for Filecoin. Are you interested in being involved? And they're like, yeah. It was pretty smooth for us in the first round for sure. So, but it's great. And I know that's like a slightly different thing from what happens in some of the other retro rounds that are happening, which tend to be one funder. I mean, it's better, I think, because you can get more donations. So you can have more say in kind of directing impact, and that's cool. It's probably a little bit technically more difficult in the sense that you just have to coordinate between the different funders to make sure everybody's like totally on the same page. But I mean, what would you say, Kiran?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I think one other factor, we didn't do a poll to determine how this shook out, but one of the fundamental premises of RetroPGF is that it's easier to assess impact looking backwards than forwards, right? And everyone wants to be efficient in their capital allocation mechanism because no one wants to waste money. So I think that was a point that probably helped to convince other people to join the RetroPGF and help fund it, is to say this is a new way to allocate capital that can use your resources to have more efficient, better outcomes, the ones that you want. And so I think the fundamental premise of RetroPGF probably played a big role as well.
I think in general, we're trying to fund these public goods in the ecosystem. And the idea is that by funding them, it's welfare increasing for the state of the system as a whole. So by funding these things, it's like net positive for absolutely everyone and giving people a chance to be involved in that and have their say. So we have 4 funders in this round. So we're very grateful for donations from Protocol Labs, Filecoin Foundation, Web3 Mine, Ramo, and Titan Network. And because they give the donations, well, they get a bit more say in terms of like what direction does the program go in, how is it shaped. They get the way we decided to do it was we said, okay, what we're going to do is we'll give you badge holder seats or the ability to allocate badge holder seats in proportion to the amount that you fund. So if you fund 25%, then you get 25% of badge holder seats. So you have more say over how the funds are allocated and the direction of the network.
And I think this is a really good point as well, sort of tying back with the goal that Filecoin ecosystem has of decentralizing storage. It's also decentralizing the decision-making process of what is needed within the ecosystem and how the different funders are seeing it from the different trenches. Is this something that you also found, for example, as you allocated the different badge holder seats among the funders, you see this increase in richness from the evaluation based on the perspective that?
I would say definitely yes. I mean, if we look at the results of the badge holder voting, one thing that jumps out is how heterogeneous the way that the different badge holders voted are. So they all have different information and they're all bringing something new. I mean, I could say, oh yeah, I think I know what's best for the ecosystem and try to allocate capital based on that, or Kiran could do it. But I mean, the point is it just wouldn't be as good as bringing together all of these different views. So it's kind of like the other stuff we talked about in terms of like effectively aggregating information with futarchy. RetroPGF program is just trying to do that. Also, it's the same basic idea.
One of the things that we've seen across the different easy RetroPGF and just retro rounds is several of the teams are using and building upon the foundations that Optimism has developed for how do you run a retro round. What are some of the assets that you might need to steward badge holders, to steward applicant projects? How do you see Filecoin contributing to this knowledge base and the way, and sort of like, how do you see your role as well in upping the game of how we conduct retro rounds in the Web3 ecosystem?
I'm happy to jump in with some details, and I think we can kind of try to extrapolate some generalizations out of that. I mean, all of the things that we're doing are open sourced in some way or another. So we did take, for Phil RetroPGF 1, we took a lot of inspiration from Optimism. And the way we did that was we looked at all of their open source published information. And we didn't talk to anyone from Optimism, but we definitely leveraged Gitcoin's expertise and Optimism's documentation to kind of pull together the framework for Phil RetroPGF 1. So one level of contribution is that we've made all of our stuff open as well. And so people can now reference that to, in addition to optimism, to understand maybe what the differences are and pick and choose how they want to design their own RetroPGF. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is in the spirit of open sourcing, right? Now, we're also open sourcing specific software that we're developing to help create these simulations to determine parameters of how we want to run around. So, for example, you were talking about upping the game. So I think we have several ideas on, let me back up and say, I think the Phil RetroPGF program is very interested to experiment rapidly and try different things. So that's like a philosophical perspective. I think we're very interested in doing that. And two ways that we're exploring how to do that are the specific voting mechanism. We're looking at different voting methods that we can implement. For example, a pairwise voting mechanism. And our contribution there is we've built a simulator that can characterize how a pairwise voting mechanism works, compare that to the way Optimism and Phil RetroPGF ran the first round, and we're open sourcing that, and we're open sourcing our analysis on that so that people can take that information and determine whether this is the right thing for them. So I think in those ways, we're looking to be very experimental, try new things, to achieve that ultimate goal of efficient capital allocation and redirecting incentives in the way that is a net positive for the ecosystem. I don't know if you have things to add there, Tom. But
I would just add, just double down on that. We want to take an open source methodology. So it's like there's going to be things to improve and there's going to be bugs in terms of how the round operates and things to fix. And it's like, well, for sure, like if you see a bug or you see something that could be better, it's like raise your hand and say, hey, this needs fixed, or like jump in and like help us fix it. Everybody should be empowered to like contribute to that. Yeah.
Yes, I definitely see that. As you mentioned, all of these different tools that are being created and then are being open sourced for others to use, they're definitely becoming or are already a really large public good that serves to improve the allocation mechanism and allocation mechanisms in general. Like one of the things that I'm a big fan of is the analysis that the Field RetroPGF team has done on both the results of the round, how much funding each one of the categories got. Like I've heard from other round operators, this is one of the main things that they want to do, like analyze the results, because they want to be able to correctly say how efficient was doing or using RetroPGF instead of going through direct grants or some other kind of mechanism, and having this playbook that others can leverage when they're thinking of how do we look back at our grants program, at our RetroPGF round? How do we move forward? Is definitely one of the things that ecosystem-wide is going to be very useful.
Yeah, and for us, like the playbook was critical because we basically took Optimism as a template, and that's our reference. We basically tried to implement that with as few changes as possible. And then as I think as we go forward, we'll make like small changes and experiment, and we'll publish what works and what doesn't work, and then hopefully that's a good reference for other people also to use.
And I just want to add that, one of the things, like you said, it's so important to raise your hand and just like share what is working, what is not working. Like, with Filecoin, we had a great experience and see this as like a long-term thing where, we did it for the first time. Easy RPGF, was born, and Filecoin was definitely one of the first ecosystems, who which committed to it. And even in the process, one of the things I've observed that you guys have been really flexible and also like so proactive in giving feedback, right? So there were like a ton of improvements, of course, as any new product it needed. So I think that was incredible, and that has helped the team so much, right? So thank you for that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, the easy RetroPGF software has been fantastic for us. Like trying to do this from scratch, 1,000 times harder, because there's just so many little things you got to implement. Whether like it's the website for people to come along and see, voting, attestations to chain. So having it kind of set up and ready to run through easy RetroPGF has made our life as like the people trying to get their own going like 100 times easier for sure.
And for example, as Sejal mentioned, this feedback and being aware of what are some of the barriers or improvements that are needed is definitely one of the things that keeps us pushing both the product, the mechanism for the voting process, for the distribution process, improving. As you are aware, there's other ecosystems besides Optimism running these different retro rounds. Is there anything that would be really valuable for the Filecoin ecosystem to receive as well from the other operators and their learnings? Like, are there some golden nuggets that you'd be like, anyone that is running a retro round as well, please share X, Y, or is there a particular forum that you would like to see take place where the different retro round operators are sharing their learnings so that we can all learn from one another?
Yeah. So I think any information is good information here. Like, because these, well, at least in my view, these are still this is a nascent experiment that's kind of spreading across the crypto community. So there have been 3 optimism rounds, 1 fill round, probably a few other projects that I'm unaware of. But we have all explored different areas of this kind of optimism. Like, we have learned different aspects of this surface of information. So sharing it is good. In general, like, negative information is also really good. We don't really publicize that too much usually, but that's just as valuable, maybe if not more, than positive information here. Know what to avoid as well as what to do.
I think a lot of the stuff that we learn is transferable and kind of generic, and it'll be useful to other ecosystems. Like, we're actually working on some stuff with Optimism now to try to simulate and understand collusion resistance in voting. Optimism are motivated to work on that for obvious reasons, because it helps them with RetroPGF. But doing that work also helps us, and it also helps any other team who's running RetroPGF runs.
Yes, definitely. Like, I think there are several problems that teams are figuring out and running into as the model gets replicated and it's adopted in different ecosystems. Like, collusion is definitely one of the things that I've heard from other of the ecosystems running rounds. That is one of their main concerns on how to avoid, especially I think for when seeding who the trusted initial group is that is going to participate as badge holders. How do you avoid collision with people that know each other really well because they've been probably interacting with with each other through their projects, which are probably participating in the round. So this is definitely one of the areas of work that are really valuable for retro round operators in general to consider. And I think to one of the points that Kiran mentioned as well in terms of how do we share the bad parts as well from our learnings? I think we're all very happy to say this was really successful and this part went really well. I would also definitely recommend using this type of communication channels, but it is part of learning from the mistakes that will enable us to improve the mechanism, get better allocation of all of these resources. Is there any advice that you would have, for example, for a team like Easy Retro PGF or for some of the other operators on how to share also the negative learnings that they are producing from these different experiments that we're running?
I don't know if there's any special way that you need to share them, but people should get special kudos for sharing them. In general scientific research, there's kind of like a movement maybe like 5 years ago or 3 years ago, and this was to kind of say, hey, we need to publish more like negative results in studies and say, oh yeah, we did this experiment and it didn't work, because you just have this bias where you only hear the positive stories. Obviously, that's just not a good thing. So I don't know. We need to accept that this is what we need to do also, is publish the negative stories too. What would you say, Kiran?
Yeah, I think what I would add there is we've taken a step towards that. So we did a retro on our retro PGF round, and we wrote a document about this. So something that comes top of mind right now is it was difficult to coordinate and get the message out about RetroPGF because we were using multiple communications channels. It seems obvious in hindsight, but at the time our motivation was to try to reach as many people, but it ended up being confusing for people to watch different channels for information updates. So that's a very specific example, but our initial step towards this was to do a retro on retro PGF round and improve the next round because of that. And this is something Optimism has also done. It's not like we invented this. So I think, having a collection of documents of a retro on retro is a good starting point. We can take it from there.
And I think along those lines, is there something like we talked about exploring pairwise form as a new voting mechanism to see different behaviors as well from voters. And this is one of the many things that are helping evolve retro rounds as a mechanism, and particularly in the public good space. Are there any other particular trends or innovations that you're excited about to bring into the field and to test out? I think this is also one of the really nice things that the Filecoin ecosystem has done really well in terms of testing things out, just putting it out there and learn from this initial result so that you're able to iterate on it. So what are some of the other innovations that you are excited to see come forth in the space?
I mean, this is like super tentative and nascent, but at a kind of philosophical level, just as we talked about before, Lao is like finding effective ways of aggregating information, i.e. with futarchy, whether that's actually for allocating the capital to teams in the ecosystem, contributing to the governance of the round itself and how the rules should update. That's one thing I'm kind of excited about. But I mean, I don't know exactly how it's going to work out, but yeah, I think that would be like super cool if we can get to something like that. Generally, other things I'm kind of excited about, I think just bringing together the different components. So like in the Filecoin RetroPGF rounds, we work very closely with Gitcoin and the easy RetroPGF software. And that's been amazing and facilitated the applications and voting and the attestations. But also, if we can combine this with other things like hypercerts to track impact, and also more technologies for on-chain payments, for example, like drips, and just bringing together all of these things. And once we kind of got all of these things like singing together and working really well, if we can do a really efficient job running these programs, ideally we should get to a place where we're not just doing this within crypto ecosystems. We should be using these crypto primitives and systems, but doing this much more generally to run grants programs. And if we can do something like that, then we've really made it, and we've created something that's like super useful. And that's where we want to get to.
I can add one thing to this, which is one of the things Optimism is doing in round 4 is they're going very heavy on the quantitative metrics and impact measurement. And I think that is a really good direction. Well, maybe I'm biased because of my background is like data science, machine learning. So I prefer that over subjective things. Now, I think there is a place for subjective in this RetroPGF. That's why we get badge holders, because this is a very hard problem. But I think ways to figure out quantitative metrics that can be a guiding or a starting point for badge holders, it's obvious in certain categories like software development. You can say, okay, how many stars does my GitHub repository have? How many people have forked it, etc. But it's very difficult to measure impact on, let's say I wrote a research article. I don't know who read it, and I don't know how many minds I've changed, which is really the measure of impact for a research article, for example. That's an interesting direction to explore. And I think we're starting from a place that we know how to measure things, which is GitHub stars, forks, etc. And we can take that as a starting point and move towards a direction where we start to experiment with measuring things that we don't really have a good idea of how to measure. And if we keep working on that, we'll get there, and that can make this process even more efficient going forward. So that's an interesting direction. I like it, but I don't have any good answers yet.
I think that was great. Now we've talked about the new experiments we want to do, and also we are towards the end of the episode, which is quite good because didn't feel like a long conversation. Feels like we just started, and I'm now thinking that probably we need a series with Filecoin because there are so many things that we are planning, and it would be good to actually unpack every experiment that we do. So I think our audience can expect something like that. Yes. So before we wrap up, we are towards the end of it. Filecoin Retro Round 2 is coming up, right? So would you like to, share any insights, or maybe I should say drop some alpha for the audience about this upcoming round and in general the grants program within the Filecoin ecosystem?
The only alpha I would give you is that the rounds are happening regularly. The second round is almost happening already. The first one feels like it's barely finished. But yeah, I mean, we're planning to kick off full Retro PGF in the autumn, in the fall of this year. If you aren't building already, get building and get ready to submit your applications pretty soon.
And is there anything in particular, like I know one of the things that you mentioned is how RetroPGF is also serving within the Filecoin ecosystem as this rallying point for people to be aware of, hey, these are the type of contributions that are really valuable in our ecosystem that we definitely want to see more of. Is there a way or is there a place in which builders can get ideas of what is needed within the Filecoin ecosystem so that they can participate in the next round?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think the intention is going to stick quite closely to the first round in that we want to keep it relatively broad brush because there's just so many things that have to happen across education, research, tooling, utilities, more. So we want to keep it open to everybody who can contribute to the ecosystem in any way, but especially apps or front ends that are making Filecoin easier to use. Because like Filecoin is this, in a sense, this like as the back end, but if we can make more front ends to make it super easy to use, then that's going to be really valuable. So just like making it easier for clients to onboard data and hearing about those stories. And another thing I've heard a lot of people talking about also is developing the DeFi side more, and on-chain payments and getting this stuff to work on FEM. So I think those are some of the things I think a lot of the people are most excited to see applications for in round 2.
Amazing. Well, this is great. Now our listeners also know where to look at and what to get their hands on and start building and contributing to the Filecoin ecosystem. Thanks a lot, both of you. This was really, really good.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you guys again.
Thanks for having us.
You just heard Tom and Kiran talk about their experience with the first round, their backgrounds, and it's amazing to see how this round just happened so suddenly and it left us with like a ton of learnings, and there's so much more to come, and the fact that they're so invested in it, yeah, it's definitely something that I'm sure after this episode everyone would look out for. So yeah, what was your favorite part, Lau?
I think one of the pieces of information that was new to me and was really exciting to hear is how the team is already collaborating as well with Optimism in terms of looking at what other type of mechanisms could be used linked to retroactive funding and how they are collaborating with some of the other participants that are hosting their own retro rounds. I think also what they shared in terms of tools that they've developed and that they are now open source for anyone else that's hosting their retro round to leverage is really amazing. I think as Optimism has done before, it should be a really important precedent for everyone that is hosting a retro round to share the resources that they are using so that more and more ecosystems are able to use it. And then we're able to continue to push forward how the retro rounds are becoming more efficient for the Web3 ecosystem overall.
Absolutely. Super excited for this and hope everyone enjoyed this. Please leave your feedback, share with us what is more you want to see. We're actually thinking of a dedicated series with Filecoin, but yes, probably we will, have that feeling with every ecosystem because, there is so much that can be unlocked.
And don't forget the next, just as with most of the other retro rounds for ecosystem, the beauty of this mechanism is you don't run it only once. The next retro round for Filecoin is coming in autumn, as was mentioned in the episode. If you want to hear more on what's going to be rewarded during that round, check out the end and take note of what you could be building for the Filecoin ecosystem.
You do not want to miss this. So yes, check that out and see you in the Filecoin round probably.